Well now, good evening, friends. Andy Taylor here. What if I told you that when wealthy Eleanor Whitmore died and left a cryptic clue about $50,000 hidden somewhere in her house? 6 people tore that house apart looking for it. And when I finally solved the mystery of where she'd hidden her fortune, the answer wasn't about money at all, but about the difference between family by blood and family by choice. This is a story about greed, about the lengths people will go to for money they think they deserve, and about how sometimes the most valuable things we possess aren't the ones we can spend on. It started on a gray October morning in 1961 when I was called to the offices of Harold Stevens, Mayberry's longtime attorney, for the reading of Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's will. Mrs. Whitmore had been one of our town's wealthiest residents, a widow who'd lived alone in the big house on Maple Street for the past 20 years since her husband passed. She died peacefully in her sleep 3 days earlier at the age of 78, and her family had gathered from various parts of the state for the funeral and will reading. I'd been asked to attend because, as Mr. Stevens explained, there were some unusual aspects to the will that might require my presence as sheriff. The room was crowded. Margaret Whitmore Davis, Eleanor's daughter, sat in the front row wearing expensive clothes and an impatient expression. Next to her was Thomas Whitmore, Eleanor's son, fidgeting nervously and checking his watch repeatedly. Behind them sat Robert Whitmore, Eleanor's grandson and Thomas's son, a young man of 25 who'd never quite found his footing in life and seemed perpetually resentful about it. Nurse Betty Collins, who'd cared for Eleanor in her final months, sat quietly in the corner. And standing near the back was Ada Thompson, the housekeeper who'd worked for Eleanor for 30 years. Looking sad and uncomfortable among all these family members, Mr. Stevens cleared his throat and began reading. Most of the will was straightforward. The house and property were to be divided among Margaret and Thomas. Various personal items were bequeathed to specific people, and there were small monetary gifts to the church and library. But then Stevens reached a section that made everyone sit up straighter. He read, "I have accumulated over my lifetime the sum of $50,000 in cash, which I have hidden somewhere in my home. This money represents my life's savings beyond the property itself, and I leave it to whoever among you can solve this riddle. Find where I hid my heart, and you will find my fortune. The money is legally yours if you can figure out what that means and locate it within 30 days of this reading." The room erupted. $50,000 was an enormous sum, more money than most people in that room would see in a lifetime. Margaret immediately started asking questions. What does that mean? Where she hid her heart? Is this some kind of game? Thomas was already on his feet, eager to get to the house and start searching. Robert looked calculating, probably already planning where he'd look first. Only Ada seemed distressed rather than excited, twisting her hands and looking down at the floor. After the meeting broke up, I pulled Mr. Stevens aside. "Harold," I said, "did Eleanor give you any indication of what this riddle means, or where the money might actually be?" He shook his head. "Andy, I tried to talk her out of this cryptic approach, suggested she just divide the money clearly in the will. But she insisted. She said she wanted to see who really understood her, who really knew where her heart was. She seemed to think it was an important test of character. Within an hour, the family had descended on the Whitmore house like a swarm of locusts. I went along to keep the peace and make sure things didn't get out of hand. Margaret immediately headed for Eleanor's bedroom, convinced the money must be hidden somewhere personal. Thomas started examining the library pulling books off shelves, looking for hidden compartments. Robert went straight to the basement, checking for loose bricks or hidden safes. Nurse Betty, who technically wasn't family and probably had no claim to the money, nonetheless joined the search, checking the rooms where she'd cared for Eleanor. And Ada, poor Ada, tried to go about her normal duties of maintaining the house while everyone tore it apart around her. Over the next 3 days, that house was searched more thoroughly than any crime scene I'd ever investigated. Floorboards were pried up. Walls were tapped for hollow spaces. The garden was dug up in multiple places. Furniture was moved, mattresses were slashed open, even the chimney was examined. And they found nothing. No cash, no safe, no hidden compartment containing $50,000. Tempers began to fray. Margaret accused Thomas of having found the money and hidden it for himself. Thomas accused Robert of the same. Robert suggested that maybe Nurse Betty had discovered it during one of her shifts and taken it. Everyone was suspecting everyone, and the situation was getting ugly. On the 4th day, I decided it was time to approach this methodically, the way I'd approach any investigation. I gathered everyone in the parlor and said I wanted to talk to each of them individually about their relationship with Eleanor and what they thought she might have meant by her clue. Margaret went first. She sat across from me, angry and frustrated. "Sheriff," she said, "my mother was a difficult woman. She never approved of my choices, thought I was too focused on material things. But I'm her daughter. That money should be mine by right." When I asked what she thought where I hid my heart might mean, she gestured around vaguely. "Her jewelry, maybe?" She loved her jewelry. But we've looked through every piece and found nothing. Thomas was next. He was more nervous than angry, sweating despite the cool weather. "I need that money, Andy," he confessed. "I've got debts, gambling debts, that are coming due soon." My mother knew about them, disapproved strongly. She said I'd never learn responsibility if she kept bailing me out. Maybe this is her way of making me work for it one last time. When I asked about the heart clue, he suggested maybe it meant her husband's grave, where her heart was buried with him. But we'd already checked there and found nothing. Robert was bitter when his turn came. "My grandmother never thought I was good enough," he said. "Never lived up to her standards. Maybe she didn't leave the money at all. Maybe this is just her final way of tormenting us, making us dance to her tune even after she's dead." He had no theories about the clue, just anger. Nurse Betty was thoughtful when I spoke with her. Mrs. Whitmore was a complex woman, she said. Strong-willed, sometimes harsh with her family, but there was kindness in her too. In her final weeks, she talked a lot about loyalty, about who'd really been there for her over the years. She seemed sad about something, regretful maybe. When I asked about the heart clue, Betty suggested it might be metaphorical rather than literal, but she couldn't say what it meant. Finally, I spoke with Ada. She was the most distressed of anyone, wringing her hands, tears in her eyes. "Sheriff," she said, "I don't understand any of this. Mrs. Eleanor was always good to me in her way. Not warm perhaps, but fair. I've worked in this house for 30 years, and I'd never take anything that wasn't mine. But now they're all looking at me suspiciously, thinking maybe I found the money and hid it. I don't know where it is. I don't know what the riddle means. I just want this to be over." That evening, I sat in my office with Barney, going over everything I'd learned. Barney had theories, of course. "Andy," he said, "what if the money was never actually there? What if this is Eleanor's revenge on her greedy family, making them tear the house apart for money that doesn't exist? Or, he continued, warming to his subject, what if the nurse took it? She had access to Eleanor in her final days, could have learned where it was hidden and taken it before anyone else had a chance. I shook my head. Neither of those fits the facts, Barney. Eleanor told her lawyer the money was real and hidden. And if someone had found and stolen it, why would they still be at the house searching? They'd have disappeared by now. I kept coming back to Eleanor's words. Find where I hid my heart. Not my treasure, not my fortune, but my heart. And that phrase she'd used with her lawyer, who really understood her, who really knew where her heart was. I started thinking about Eleanor's life, about the relationships she'd had. Her husband had died 20 years ago. Her children visited rarely and usually wanted something. Her grandson had been a disappointment to her. But Ada had been there for 30 years, day in and day out, maintaining her home, seeing to her needs, present in a way none of the family members had been. I thought about something else Ada had said. Mrs. Eleanor was always good to me in her way. Not warm, perhaps, but fair. The next morning, I went back to the Whitmore house. Ada was in the kitchen, preparing lunch while the family continued their increasingly desperate search of the property. Ada, I said, can I ask you about something? Do you have a private space in this house? Somewhere that's yours? She looked surprised by the question. Well, yes, she said. I have a small room off the kitchen where I keep my things, where I sleep when Mrs. Eleanor needed me to stay over. It's not much, just a bed and a dresser and a little desk. Can you show me? I asked. She led me to a modest room, simply furnished, but clean and comfortable. I looked around carefully. On the desk were a few framed photographs. Ada with her late parents, Ada at a church social. And there was a music box, old and beautiful, sitting in the place of honor on the dresser. Ada saw me looking at it. Mrs. Eleanor gave me that, she said softly, about 10 years ago. It was her mother's music box, very precious to her. She said she wanted someone who would appreciate it to have it, someone who understood its value. I'd never opened it. It seemed too special, too personal. Ada, I said gently, I think you should open it now. She looked at me questioningly, but lifted the lid. The familiar tune began to play, and there, nestled in the velvet lining beneath the mechanism, were neat stacks of $100 bills. Ada gasped and stepped back. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would she put money in my music box? I didn't know about this, Sheriff. I swear I didn't. I believed her. The placement of the money, the care with which it was hidden, the timing of the gift, it all made sense now. Ada, I said, I think Eleanor left this money to you. I think when she said find where I hid my heart, she meant you. You were her heart, her true family, the person who'd been loyal and present for 30 years, while her blood relatives were absent or difficult. She couldn't just give you the money outright, because legally it would have been contested. But if you found it in a gift she'd already given you, following a clue about her heart, it would be harder for anyone to challenge. Ada sank into a chair, overwhelmed. But the family, she said, Margaret and Thomas and Robert, they need the money more than I do. They're expecting it. I shook my head. They expected it because of greed, not need. And Eleanor knew that. She wanted her fortune to go to someone who valued her for herself, not for what she could provide. We had to inform the family, of course. I gathered them all in the parlor and explained what had been found and where. The reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Margaret was outraged. "That's our money," she shouted. "Our inheritance. She was our mother." Thomas looked stricken, probably thinking about his gambling debts. Robert was angry, but less surprised, as if he'd always expected to be disappointed. Only Nurse Betty looked pleased, nodding as if something had finally made sense. Mr. Stevens, the lawyer, was called to examine the situation. After reviewing everything carefully, he gave his legal opinion. The will stated that the money belonged to whoever could solve the riddle and locate it. Ada solved the riddle, even if inadvertently, by being the person where Eleanor had hidden her heart. And the money was found in her possession, in a gift legally given to her 10 years ago. I believe the money is rightfully hers. Margaret threatened to contest it, of course. But Mr. Stevens pointed out that such a contest would be expensive, lengthy, and given the clear intent of Eleanor's will and her actions, unlikely to succeed. Over the following days, the family's anger gradually gave way to something else, reflection, perhaps, or shame. Margaret came to see me privately. "Sheriff," she said, "I've been thinking about my mother and about what she must have thought of us. We only came around when we wanted something. We complained about her difficulty, but never tried to understand why she'd become that way. Alone in that big house with only Ada for real company. Maybe she was right to give the money to someone who actually cared about her." Thomas had a similar realization. "I'm going to deal with my debts another way," he told me. "Sell some things, get a second job maybe. My mother was trying to teach me something with this whole situation, and I think I finally understand it. As for Ada, she was overwhelmed by the sudden fortune. $50,000 was more than she'd earn in a lifetime of housekeeping. She kept saying she didn't deserve it, didn't need it, should share it with the family. But I encouraged her to honor Eleanor's wishes. Mrs. Whitmore knew what she was doing, I told her. She wanted to reward loyalty and love, not blood ties and greed. You gave her 30 years of your life, Ada. You earned this money in the truest sense." Ada eventually accepted the money and did something characteristically generous with it. She gave small amounts to each of the family members, not because they deserved it, but because Eleanor would have wanted her to be kind. She donated a significant portion to the church and library that Eleanor had loved, and she kept enough to ensure a comfortable retirement. Buying a small house of her own after 30 years of living in other people's homes. The case of the disappearing inheritance taught me something about the nature of family and value. Eleanor Whitmore's biological family assumed that blood gave them rights to her fortune. They thought of her money as something they were entitled to, something they deserved simply by virtue of being related. But Eleanor saw things differently. She understood that family isn't just about biology. It's about presence, about loyalty, about who shows up day after day, not when it's convenient or profitable, but when it's simply needed. Ada had been more family to Eleanor than her own children, and Eleanor wanted to acknowledge that, even if she had to do it through a cryptic riddle and a hidden fortune. The story also revealed something about greed and how it blinds us to what really matters. Margaret, Thomas, and Robert spent days literally tearing apart Eleanor's house, so focused on finding money that they missed the real treasure, the lesson about love and loyalty that Eleanor was trying to teach them. They looked in walls and floorboards and gardens, never thinking to look in the simple room of the woman who'd cared for their mother when they couldn't be bothered to. By the time they found the money, the real inheritance, the understanding of what Eleanor valued had already been claimed by the one person who'd understood her heart all along. Well now, that's the story of the $50,000 that wasn't stolen, but was lost in plain sight. Hidden where Eleanor Whitmore had truly hidden her heart, in the devotion and care of the woman who'd been her real family for 30 years. It's a story about how the answer to a mystery is sometimes less about clues and deduction, and more about understanding people and what they truly value. Eleanor's riddle wasn't designed to be clever. It was designed to reveal character, to show who understood that wealth isn't just measured in money, but in love, loyalty, and the quiet dignity of someone who shows up day after day, year after year, simply because they care. If you're fortunate enough to have someone in your life like Ada, someone whose loyalty is unwavering and whose presence is constant, remember that they're more valuable than any inheritance. And if you're lucky enough to be that person for someone else, know that your value is seen and appreciated, even if it's not always expressed in words. Eleanor Whitmore may have been harsh and difficult, but in the end, she understood what mattered. She understood where her heart truly was, and she made sure the world would eventually understand it too. Come back and visit again real soon, friends. Until then, this is Andy Taylor saying goodnight from Mayberry. Remember, the most valuable inheritances aren't the ones measured in dollars, but in the love, loyalty, and care we show each other every single day. Take care now.